Good afternoon. This is the Board of County Commissioners Board Work Session. It is Thursday, August 3rd, 2023. It is 2:02 p.m. The session is set to go until 3 p.m. Hybrid meeting. We're at 3000 Pacific Avenue Southeast, room 110. For public virtual attendance, you may follow along on the Thurston County YouTube channel. I will go ahead and pass it to the county manager because there was a mistake on the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Like at the previous briefing, there was a typographical error on the paper agenda that is before you. And this briefing should be going from 2 o'clock to 3 in the afternoon. All the agendas on the online, the master calendar, as well as on the website are correct. So I just want to make that note, and is a typographical error on your paper agenda today. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Carolina Mejia, I'm the chair of the board, and in the boardroom is Vice Chair Ty Menser as well as Commissioner Gary Edwards. And today we are going to be discussing the wireless code update briefing. I'm passing it straight to Josh.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. I am Joshua Cummings, the Director of Community Planning and Economic Development at CPED, joined by Andrew Bond, who is the lead on this topic. This topic has been a long and winding road with multiple staff members engaged. Andrew is our newest staff member to take this topic on, and we appreciate the hard work that he's done in getting up to speed. We also have the board's legal counsel, Ken Feldman, on the line, as well as CPED member Tasha Knight taking notes. So this is a continuation of the conversation. I'll let Andrew take it from here to kind of get us up to speed and then see what the next steps are in terms of decisions. So, Andrew, take it away.
Let me go ahead and share my presentation.
Oh, you share.
Good. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Andrew Bond, Community Planning. Today's work session is on the wireless code update, and part of this work session, we will be discussing topics that were kind of outstanding with the board and bringing forward options for staff to move forward with to develop language to address those concerns. So today's briefing, I will provide an overview of the topics and the options that we've developed for the board to consider. And then following the presentation, I'm going to bring it to a roundtable discussion, kind of leading the presentation just as an overview and really going into the meat at the roundtable part. And then staff are hoping to receive direction from the board on which options they would like staff to move forward with. And there are kind of cause and effects at the end of the presentation that I'll go into as to what the decisions may lead to. So the first topic that was kind of an outlying topic is the radio frequency emissions, and public comment expressed concern over the effects of those emissions and the lack of testing authority that the county had. And so staff kind of came up with two options. The first will be revising the regulations so that we will have the authority to conduct those tests and that the property owner shall provide access. And there will be obviously the expenses that come to the county for those inspections, or option two, which would be to maintain the code as it's currently written.
Can we ask you about those two options now?
Yeah.
I can't see Madam Chair, so.
Go ahead, sir.
On this particular process, okay, option one is a change to kind of meet what needs to be. Option two is leave it alone, but if we leave it alone, does that address the requirement that we update our code?
So the first option is more to address the concerns that were raised by the public.
Yeah.
Option two maintains the current draft that you have before you and all of the abilities that the county has in that draft. It is still a change from the current code that we have.
Oh,
this
okay.
is just
That's a good
an
clarification.
expansion upon that section.
Okay, thank you.
Moving forward, the second topic was related to setbacks, and there were concerns that the ordinance may be a bit confusing and lead to misinformation related to where wireless communication facilities could be located. Option one would be the reorganization of those standards. And from staff's perspective, it would lead to 1 to 2 tables where we would consolidate the standards located throughout the code into one section that anyone wanting to know a setback would be able to learn. Some of the considerations with that is it may address the confusion issues that the public may be having with the code. There would be no changes to the actual standards, so the setback or spacing standards. It would just be the reorganization of those standards. And then option two would be a no change, and so that would just maintain the code as it's currently written. There are the chances that it may be perceived as
Madam
confusing.
Chair, I'm thinking slow today or something. So option two is to maintain the draft code that's
Correct.
currently written,
All the
right?
options that you see as an option two
Yeah,
to maintain
okay, I
is
just
related
wanna
to the
make sure
current
we're,
draft.
okay,
Yeah.
that's all, just a little dense today.
Option one will be an expansion on what you have before you today. And then the final topic is public notice, and there was questions and concerns over the lack of public noticing for an administrative permit. And so option one would be to revise the regulations to add a notice of application, which would take place upon receipt of an administrative permit for a wireless communication facility, and that would be administered by the Building Development Center. Some of the considerations when discussing that would be that it will provide notice to the property owners. There will not be a public comment period. This is just simply letting them know what's happening. It will require additional staff time in the BDC to implement this rule. They will have to gather all of the information for all the property owners within a certain distance, as well as all of the postage and documentation needed to notify them.
And who pays for that?
And that would fall to the counties
Well,
to,
but would that be passed on to the applicant? That's, I guess, where I'm going with it.
it
Would
would
that additional cost be passed to the applicant?
it would probably be reviewed within the overall fee for the permit. And so during the fee study, if that were to move forward, it potentially could be encompassed within
Added
the
to the fee.
overarching fee. Yeah, that's just one set fee. Option two would just maintain the code as it's currently written, which does have a noticing period, but that's only for those special use permits, the large scale facilities. And it ensures that we do maintain the review timelines established by federal law. And it would not require any additional staff time to actually implement this rule. So the process to date, we've had a long process to get to this point. Kickstarted in 2021 and kind of following the public hearing in February of 2023 and the executive sessions in May. This is kind of the remaining pieces that we're hoping to iron out with the board and bring forward for final action. So the options that staff are hoping to have addressed today, it's kind of a two-parter. If any of the topics need to have changes done to them, we will make those changes to whichever topic you decide on. Or if the board does not wish to make any changes, staff will move forward following this meeting and submitting an AIS for final action. I've gone ahead and scheduled some work sessions later this month on the 23rd and the 31st to address any remaining questions, concerns, and bring forward any new code that is requested by the board, and with the possibility of final action in September. And that closes that out.
Can we go back?
Yeah.
A couple of slides. So I think that is the roundtable. So in terms of the board talking about the options to consider, those are the three big right there. And if I may, the public notice conversation where we ended last time was, it's really unclear, kind of nebulous on how much effort and time that would take for Brett's staff, the BDC. So we don't have any real cost, time, resources to put our hand around that. And so if the board did want to move forward on that, it would take some effort within our Development Services Group to come up with some estimates.
Okay, so bullet point one, radio frequency emissions,
I started at the bottom.
pardon?
I started a public notice at the bottom.
How many are there every year that would have to be noticed up?
We had this conversation last time, and I don't have my numbers. It was like 40 a year that are the smaller ones, and only like 2 a year that are the really big ones.
And we're saying the public notice would apply to the smaller and the bigger?
The last conversation was all of them, right?
The regulation change right here would just apply to the smaller ones. The larger ones already have the special use permit requirement, which has the hearing examiner public hearing. And so they would already have the noticing, they would have the public comment. It's just the administrative ones that are done internally.
And these are the ones where we don't have discretion, so it was like the notice needs to say I'm going from Mr. Feldman's memo from May, that we would need to be really clear that on the notice that, hey, we're just letting you know, but you know, I mean,
Exactly.
in so many words that the board really has to approve it based on the guidelines. So there isn't a comment period or
Right.
That's correct.
And the appeal, there's nothing, it was just informational to the public.
and then specified distance, I think is all it said in the thing.
Commissioner Mejia.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt it, but just on that point, if I could, for the small cell facilities, all these facilities that don't fit into the big tower proceedings that you just heard about, some of those, while they may be administrative, there is still some amount of discretion that the county has on exactly where on the lot it's going to be placed, on what the camouflage nature of the site is going to be. So there's administrative approval for some sites where you do have some discretion, and then there's a whole other category of sites, some for the larger facilities and some for the very small ones, if they meet the criteria of what's called the 6409 rule. That's where the county has no discretion at all. So what we're talking about here on public notice, there might be an opportunity for some people to have an opportunity to weigh in and provide their opinions that could be taken into consideration, and another category where they couldn't. And we would just have to distinguish that in two different kinds of public notice for these smaller sites.
So that's different than what's proposed here, though.
I really don't think it is different. I think if we create a public notice, if the board directs staff to create a notice application for administrative permits, because there are different kinds of administrative permits, some of them will have the language that explains why the county has no discretion for these kinds of permits, and the other, will describe that, if you want to provide some feedback on aesthetics or those kinds of issues that we can consider, here's a way to do that.
So based on what you're describing, Ken, seems like the administrative process to notify just triplicate the effort, the way you described.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's double or triple, it depends upon how many applications come in
But it is, I
under
mean, just.
which category. But you will need different kinds of notice.
Yeah, but start dissecting the type of notices that we need to make, and then developing a process for those who perhaps some have some discretion. That by itself, my reaction becomes a very administrative burning process.
Right. And it's a policy decision whether you want to allow for feedback from the public for administrative approvals. I mean, many administrative approvals in other contexts, staff just makes determinations. You don't have public feedback. So it could be public notice just saying, here's this kind of a site, and there's no process to weigh in for the public. And then there's another kind of notice that says, here's a process for here's another kind of application. And please note, for this application, the county has no discretion. Not only is this an administrative approval, but if they meet certain criteria, we are required by federal law to approve. And in both cases, then you're not providing for public input. So that's a policy decision to make.
I think I would add also that we don't provide, as far as I'm aware, noticing to the public of any of our administrative decisions that don't require it at this time.
That's correct.
So what I'm hearing from Ken though is that we can though, like there's that flexibility and the public notice. That we can receive public comment and that, kind of the decision point really for the board is whether we want to really take on that administrative burden of what it would cost, like basically cost to staff, something like that.
Yeah, that is exactly the request from the staff, is whether the board approves the notice of application based on what Ken just described, or just move forward with the way the language is presented to you in the draft.
Is this just for adjoining landowners, the general public within a X distance?
It's usually within an X distance, and so I'd have to go back and look and see how we generally handle that, but it's not typically for administrative that you would see one of these types of
Right.
notices. This is
You
generally
can't just
kept
put up a
in-house.
big placard when you drive by, that doesn't meet the requirements? Or-
That's only for public hearings, and so the ones that would be going to the hearing examiner get both the noticing mailed to the adjacent property owners and the on-site noticing that the code language we just addressed not too long ago. So this would be a new administrative process specific for wireless.
And something can say, RCW or WAC or federal code, whatever, which, the county, don't bother calling us, the county doesn't have any say or something like that, I don't know. You wouldn't wanna put it that way, but.
Probably not.
So, thank you, Commissioner Edwards. So, Ken, what if, so if we get to write this anyway, we get to provide the options. What if, could we write into this notice of application that the applicant puts a sign up at the location to be determined for the type 1 wireless units?
Right, remind me, is type 1 the administrative?
That's correct.
Yeah, you could do that, sure.
Maybe that's all. Does it? No.
No, but I'm just curious, we provide this administrative notice, whether it's a record or, email, or mail, whatever that notification is. And the public has a little bit of the board has the latitude to consider those comments. But I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the board doesn't have the latitude to deny an application.
Correct.
It's just the concept of receiving public comment in that particular type of applications will be move it to the left, move it to the right, or change the color. I'm just exaggerating and here, right? But really, the board doesn't have the latitude to deny that application.
We probably can't put restrictions in place to the point that
So
they
I
can't meet
just,
it.
I just want to make sure that we understand what that public notice really does. Because the board will not have the latitude to deny that application based on the public feedback that we receive as a result of the public notice.
That's correct. If the application aligns with all the standards outlined in the code and conforms to any of the placement, camouflaging and so on that's established by staff, there would be no nexus to deny the application based on public comment.
Right. There's one other thing that you can consider, and this doesn't have to be in the code at all. It can just be a policy of the county. And I may have mentioned this in a prior meeting. I apologize if this is redundant for you, but I've seen a number of jurisdictions put up on their government webpage a wireless page. And you have a page that every time there's an application filed for any kind of wireless permit, whether it's a public hearing kind of permit or an administrative approval, you just, put an orange pin at the location and say, there's an application for this kind of permit at this site. And when these things get approved, to have another page to show, here's all the sites that have been approved by the county. Then any member of the public, any day of the week, any time of the day, can go to your website and find out, is there anything in my neighborhood that's been applied for? And is there anything that's already been approved? So that's another way to be transparent to your public about your wireless facilities and your applications that are pending, without getting into how much staff time is it going to take to, come up with all these different public notice processes.
So, thank you, Ken. All due respect, that's still a resource-heavy pathway.
Fair enough.
Thinking of the applicant, having it written in that the applicant provides on-site, that it's a requirement that, by the way, neighbors, I'm going to be putting up a wireless unit here, that, from my perspective, puts less staff resource in any one of our departments, but still provides some level of notification to the locals.
And we get to put the verbiage on what he puts up.
Like a standard language.
Well, I guess and have it say, we don't have a choice, or we can't do anything about it, or whatever.
So there,
Shift the burden over to the feds, call your congressman.
and with that approach, we can kind of take it in two directions. We can codify that in code, or we can establish that an on-site noticing is required for an administrative permit, and then the building development center staff can base just generalization on how they do general noticing, how they outline what it says, how it looks, what size, and all the parameters that's generally seen with a public noticing on site. And the building development center can actually kind of establish a standardization.
See, that is a good point. I mean, if the board decides to go with some sort of notice of application, if that is the direction, then it will be a direction from the board, not necessarily codified, because
Yeah.
to really start codifying that kind of stuff is, I don't think it's appropriate. It's just my.
More text in the code.
Well, it adds a layer of work for the applicant that is a consistent path for then, it's not just targeted to wireless, it's all administrative. It's an interesting concept.
I think the challenge is, right, you want transparency on some level, but at the same time, you want to manage expectations. Because if there is you create a false expectation by having some notification that the public can then influence the outcome, then you just create frustration that the board ends up having to deal with of our own making. So on some level, the additional notice could actually create more concern. So I know it's potentially a burden, but yeah, having it such that there's a standardized form for the applicant to post could be quite simple.
Madam Chair, one other quick question. I don't know if it's directly affect with this, but
Go ahead.
we started off 3G and then 5G, and now I see there's something 10G coming. So does it ever end, and what's the particulars of this? Is it, are we gonna be fighting this at every advancement of technology? I'm just curious. Ken, are you dealing with any of that kind of stuff?
There were records, then there were 8 tracks, then there
Yeah.
were cassettes.
Yeah, it's kind of the
When is it
same
gonna
thing.
end, people?
CDs.
Yeah, Commissioner, you've identified a good point about technology. We don't know what it's going to look like 5 years from now. They are talking about 6G standards now, even though most of the country doesn't have 5G yet. And frankly, we're talking about wireless here, and we're talking about trying to find a way to maximize local regulatory control within a preemptory framework that the Congress has imposed upon us. And there's a bill in the House of Representatives right now that would further restrict local authority, not just with wireless facilities, but with wireline facilities, so fiber optic installations in the streets. So we could pass this code in September, and I think given the nature of the politics in Washington, D.C. right now, it's unlikely that, if a bad bill comes out of the House, that it would get through the Senate. But, who's to say what after the 2024 election, what it might look like. So we're going to be dealing with this for a long time. Technology is going to continue to change. The industry is going to continue to push restrictions on local authority. And we're just going to have to both advocate for local control where we can and react to what Washington imposes on us when we have to.
Thank you.
So, fine. So I kind of jumping back to the decision points of today. What we're hoping to gain is just a general direction of how you'd like us to approach the upcoming meetings. And the board has 2 options for either. Obviously, we can manipulate or expand upon any of those options. but we would like to just receive some sort of direction. We can go line by line, or the conversation around just the noticing kind of seemed like we were open to noticing, but then also not, and just all the burdens that go with that, so trying to iron it out.
Yeah, let's stick with that. Public noticing, Board of County Commissioners, you fall on any side, recognizing that the expectations for noticing may not be fruitful for the public, but transparency is also an opportunity. Any thoughts on whether or not we should consider public noticing?
And the type, right? I mean,
Yeah, starting first with, should we consider it? And secondly, what type, if so?
And
So you're starting from the bottom, Josh?
in what area? I mean, what you,
I like the idea of the website, and because I think it gives people access to like seeing which permits are currently being considered. So for me, I'm all about a public notice.
and that's what Ken.
Maybe we can, if I may, Madam Chair, the board can weigh in on the high level direction. Are you considering a public notice, and then we can start discussing the details of public notice?
The public notice, recognizing that the expectations may be set limited, given that we still have to approve, even if people provide their input.
Is the website public notice? Is that a form of public notice?
That's the
So-
latitude that you have.
So that could be our public notice, like the chair said. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Chair? That would be it?
Well, yeah, I guess it would be like option one if we're breaking it down. Like I would like to, based on the options that we've been given. But for me, I would like to establish a public process on
Okay,
it.
so that's great. So if you can, Commissioner Mejia states that she would like to go with a notice of application.
And do that on,
How about and then if the board agrees with the notice of application, then we can start
Figure it out.
discussion to figure out what type. Would that work? So is the board for, Commissioner Mejia is stating she would like to have a notice of application. Commissioner Mensah, Commissioner Edwards.
I agree.
yeah, I think I'm
So
fine with them.
you have
Okay.
direction, the notice of application. Now, maybe for the next meeting, we can bring some options on that. Would that work?
Yeah, so the options that I think I heard were the big one, which is the county is responsible for mailings and notification. The second one is the applicant is responsible for putting an on-site notification. And third is the county stands up a website internally that external users can find applications in process and sites approved.
Yeah, and if you can add to those three options, the level of effort.
Effort and resources,
And why did you say that website was gonna be added work?
because it's a new website.
Pardon?
It's a new website, and so the
No, I mean,
data.
don't you just add a little spot on the county's website?
Well, then you have to clean the computer screen and it doesn't, just kidding.
There is an effort and update in the website, that's what he means. I mean, it's not just.
It's not a
Putting a pin on a map can't be as much as figuring out all the parcels that are so many feet and filling out notices and doing a mailing. I
Yeah,
mean,
That's what
It's
will come
gotta
up.
be a lot less resource intensive.
Yeah,
If
so
you did
but-
the on-site posting plus the website, maybe
So-
that's,
That's what, it
good
will
as-
maybe, there may not be, in comparison to other options, the level of effort will be minimum, you're right. But I think that will be the next conversation at the next meeting, what the options you may
and you
have.
guys gonna talk about, cause it just says in the memo, specified distance, are you gonna tell us what that distance would be?
I'll work with the
That's
BDC
gonna
to
appear
establish
on-
just what their general.
Yeah, what the radius of notification will be on.
Yeah,
option
cause
one.
someone said 600 feet and someone said adjacent, and I didn't know what was the proposal.
And we'll see if there's like Andrew said, something that's already established that we can attach it to.
I think I got an email from a constituent about it, adjacent
Yeah.
or something.
Well, in the rural area, 600 feet, it's not gonna be anybody.
It's one
But
parcel.
if you're in the UGA and
It
you're in
could be
subdivision, it could
everybody.
be, well, it could be, yeah, it could be 20 houses, I don't know,
Sure.
something like that.
So we'll bring some proposals about that for next meeting.
Those three options and level of effort.
So I guess we'll just jump back to the top, radio frequency emissions. So the option one would be to establish some sort of testing capabilities by the county and
May,
all-
or are you saying, is that the may portion of it?
Yeah, because there's an option for you.
Yeah, not making it that we have to do it, but may do it.
And Ken, correct me, we're not allowed to say that we will require testing. That's why we said may, correct?
Right. I mean, that's been one of the issues that's been debated all through the planning commission discussions. I know there are some people out there in the community, and frankly, there are some attorneys in the country who think you can. I strongly feel like we cannot require anything beyond what the FCC requires because of the federal preemption. And for that reason, I do not think we have the legal authority to impose on an applicant or the owner of a site the requirement to pay for a radio frequency test. We can do the test, and I think if we pay for it, we insulate the county from legal claims for exceeding your legal authority.
Ken, I was looking at my notes from last meeting and you did say, or someone said, in Palo Alto, they made them come back a year later with a test and it hadn't been challenged in court, but it was not really pushed back on much in terms of when they passed it. Am I remembering that right, or did I write that right?
I do remember that was the result of looking into the Palo Alto situation, yes.
But even, and if, I may probably use it was more of a feel-good policy, because there is really no teeth behind it. Because what are we going to do with that test results? Goes
Turn it
back
over to the
to,
FCC.
And
it
they'll
goes
say they
back,
don't
goes
have-
back to what the latitude the board will have to deny an application because of any results of any testing. So it goes back to the same point, is it a feel-good policy to request whether the county does a test or the applicant, you can now impose that on the applicant, as you heard. So the county is gonna go through a testing process, and then what?
Well, the argument is that this is a feel-good policy because we're not gonna do it. We're only gonna do it if somebody else did a test and showed us that it was a problem.
Right.
Because we're not gonna go do it. So
Exactly.
the argument is this is a feel-good policy. What you should do is require them to do it. Ken's saying,
You cannot.
Yeah.
he's saying he doesn't think so, but others do. And others have passed it.
And what happens if they don't? Because the FCC doesn't require it either. That's the problem, isn't it?
I mean, they won't probably do anything, I don't know what they'll do about it. I don't know how all that works.
But even if you impose, let's say, assume you take the risk and impose on an applicant to make the testing, to do the testing,
Here,
and what are we gonna do with the results of the test?
yeah, we don't even know how to analyze it.
It says here, it's not on this it's not on this slide, but you said that the proposed policy is that we can test, and if we do, and we don't like the result, the enforcement will be purely through the federal government.
we would forward the data to the federal
So
government.
that's
to-
what we would do.
Right, but you will not be able to deny an application.
Right.
Well,
Oh, it's not
yeah, they
about
would
that.
they would
It's about
already
forcing
have the
them
application.
to follow the law.
Yeah.
on-
So
on-
they already
Yeah.
will have the application, so, and
This would simply be testing a site once it's operational to see if it is in compliance. I mean, when you grant the application, you're looking at proposed propagation numbers from radio frequency engineers, and you're looking at opinions from radio frequency engineers saying, this site will not violate the federal standards in my best judgment. I think what the testing is for is if you wanted to do that, and that's why we had it set up as a may and as something the county could pay for. If the citizens are concerned about it and they think there's damaging radiation that violates the federal law, or they can say, please have this tested. And if you agree, you go out and you have it tested. And if it demonstrates that it's in compliance, then everybody should feel a little bit better. We went out and tested. It was fine. It's like doing a sales tax audit in a city. Okay, they've paid what they're entitled to. We still checked, but we have no enforcement to do because they're obeying the law. If they're not in compliance, you report it to the FCC. And in my experience, the FCC takes these things pretty seriously. And I think if they got good evidence of a failure to comply, that they would take certain action to enforce compliance.
How much do these tests cost?
Yeah, that's what my question, how much was the test gonna cost?
When we've done them before, they've usually been anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000, depending upon the size of the site, the number of places that you would want to test in the area. The small cells probably would be a little bit lower because they don't propagate as far. The tower sites might be a little bit more, and antenna sites, when the antennas are attached to buildings, might also be a little bit more, because you're looking at what is the exposure on the ground, but also what is the exposure, on the inside walls to where the antennas are, or in the office spaces just below the roof of where the antennas are located. So it really depends upon the site, but usually, a few $1,000s in that range.
On the May, putting May in, so, okay, now we have an option, at least 5 years from now, or I don't know, down the road somewhere, somebody comes up with some science that says, yeah, it deteriorates the inner bone in your ear or something like that with radio waves above a certain amount. At least we'd have it in place to go check that, I guess, huh? I mean, gives us an option.
Yeah, I agree. By putting that, I mean, frankly, you could do the test anyway, even if you didn't put it in the code. And that was something that we raised in the public discussions in front of the Planning Commission and with the citizen advisory group that the board put together. And that wasn't I hope I'm not misstating, and I certainly don't intend to misstate anything that the concerned citizens were raising, but I don't think that was sufficient for them. I think they wanted, I think in their perfect world, they would have a mandatory requirement and imposing an obligation on the applicant to do the test. I think where I have come down and what my recommendations to the county have been is, if doing a test will provide a level of comfort to the community, you can certainly require that tests get done. But if you want to protect the county from potential liability for exceeding your legal authority, then have the county pay for the test.
Okay, so May solves it, right? Doesn't May kind of solve it?
I think the decision at this point, maybe we can bring some suggestions again for next meeting as to how is, whether you'd like to explore the testing or not. And if you do, then we'll bring some options at the next meeting as to how that could be, whether it's you can impose to an applicant or the county can do the test, and how long after that antenna has been put in place. So all those details can probably be, if the board decides to explore this, that's really the
How
decision.
about just put in there, future science deems necessary?
That's a catch-all.
I mean, the proposal is my absolute minimum. I'm still thinking about going further, but I certainly would want the language that reserves that right with access for us. I mean,
Okay, so you're suggesting that
That'd be
to
the
have
May,
the
the May,
testing.
May is an absolute floor for me.
yeah, okay,
And when you say, does it solve it? Well,
probably not.
if the problem, it depends how you frame the problem. I mean, we have a community work group, and a draft code, and if we're trying to get to an acceptable compromise, it's not gonna solve that. Cause they say throw out the whole, set of proposals and start over.
And I would be interested to, as it's implemented, if we go down that path, at what point, what triggers enact the May, and how do we, CPED, bring that forward to the board for direction to go do a
At the
test? on one
discretion of the
sites?
fire marshal.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I couldn't help
That was good.
that.
Okay,
For me, it's the implementation. How are we gonna actually do this if the board directs?
Hire one of Ken's professionals to come out if we say May.
So, Commissioner Messer likes to keep that option of the testing with the May, the county. How about you, Commissioner?
I'll go along with that.
Commissioner Mejia?
Yeah, I think she's shaking her head, yeah. Her fist is down here, so we got
So you
four
got that one?
fingers and a thumb.
Okay, we have 3 Board of County Commissioners saying explore. Board of Commissions,
And we'll bring details for your consideration at the next meeting.
the language.
Yeah, the language. Language, time, a little bit of the logistics. The last and not least,
No, definitely
Last
not
and not
least.
least, setbacks. And so the two options are obviously maintain the code as it's currently written, or revise the code in some capacity to reorganize it in a way that kind of consolidates the setback and spacing standards in either one table, 2 tables, and keep them in a very respective section of this is setbacks, this is spacing. Or maintain the code as it's currently written.
This is one where I was scratching my head because when I went through my notes, I mean, we had all kinds of questions and specifics, and then this is just so, I just felt like this really missed the mark. I mean, yeah, go ahead and clarify or whatever, but I don't know that that's gonna answer any of the questions that the board had. Just reading back through Ken's memo, I mean, just to give you a flavor, I mean, there's lots in here, but one of the things was, here, if the county is interested in trying to figure out the largest setback that can be imposed while still protecting against claims that the setbacks amount to an unreasonable prohibition, which is kind of what the board wanted to do, we recommend reviewing each zoning district within the county, finding out how far back properties are typically set from lot lines, and calculating what setback number would not preclude the ability to site wireless infrastructure on utility poles in most locations within each zoning district. And I know Commissioner Mejia had asked for some mapping that she wanted to see and whatnot, and I mean, none of that's really, and that's just one piece of like 4 or 5 pieces, and I don't understand how proposing a clarifying chart addresses any of that.
Let us try again. I know what you're referencing. We had gone over some of the pictures in our last conversation, and we relayed, or Caitlin relayed, that it's so different in each one of the different areas that a singular picture doesn't do it justice, which is how I think we got to this consolidating those 2 pieces.
I mean, in her memo from May 15th, you know, like she had this memo with this chart and,
Yep.
you know, it says, so my notes said that because I was asking, well, when could it ever be 5 or 10 feet? And you guys were, and I had in my notes that someone said, well, that would only be in a commercial zone, you know, that would never happen near a home.
Right.
But her chart says residential zone, building setbacks, 5 to 25 feet. And I was confused about, and I know there's an explanation because it's like the tower height versus, or this, or that, whatever's low. I mean, I think her chart wasn't really clear. But it created confusion on my part, and I still never really got my answer as to how close could this be to a home or a school place or a workplace? You know, I don't care about a warehouse, but places that people are. And does that seem reasonable to us as commissioners?
Yeah.
And I thought we were gonna have answers on some of that, and we were gonna look at maps, and
Yep.
You told us that the maps may not show what we want to show, but we'll at least take a look. And I'm just wondering.
I remember, and I think we need to have a better breakdown on the type 1, 2, and 3, because that was it. It was the pictures of the little white rectangles that could potentially go on, I think we talked about Frog Pond, the grocery store on Capitol Way, and how that's kind of close to houses. We don't have many of those in the county, but that would be a type 1. And then type 2, what the picture looks like and how close it could be. So like I said, let staff take another shot at that. I think that we could address that differently.
I'm curious what my seatmates think about that. 'Cause
And you're right, because the board requested a map,
Yep.
especially for the power poles and having a somewhat of a circular,
Yep.
it's just, we didn't have the data to provide the map.
And I think there was something even about it being on the corner of a building that's apartment or apartment type
I
thing,
recall.
something. What are some of the other jurisdictions, and Commissioner mentioned Palo Alto, is that the way it's?
Palo Alto.
Palo Alto. How did they address the same question that we're dealing with right now? How did they address the setback?
And Kate include that in the memo. Ken, do you want to answer the Commissioner Edwards' question on the setbacks in Palo Alto?
Yeah, I'm I have that memo pulled up that we put together. And I'm trying to find There were so many jurisdictions
Right.
mentioned. Let me find Palo Alto and see
Well,
if that was
I
one of
picked
the
that
issues.
one because they're smart guys down there in that country about tech, right?
Stanford.
Let's see. Here we go, Palo Alto. The issues that, so just to give everyone a reminder, all of the different jurisdictions we looked into came from requests from some concerned citizens in the county that said, you should do it like these communities are doing it. And they raised certain issues. Some of them were public notice, some of them were RF, some of them were setbacks. And at least in my notes and my memo, I see the issues that we dealt with in Palo Alto that were being proposed related to notice and hearings and appeal rights and with radio frequency emissions, but not with setbacks. There were other there were other provisions from other communities in California and other places dealing with setbacks. And sometimes there, again, remember that we're dealing with both everything from the small cells in the neighborhoods to the macro tower sites. In some of these other communities that we're dealing with setbacks, they dealt with the big sites and, you know, how many feet away from the property line for a tower and how many feet away from schools facilities had to be, but not necessarily when you had it in a residential area, how far away it was. So it's really all over the place. And I think one of the things that Kate pointed out, and I don't remember if it was during the meeting or in some of the discussions that we had just on the staff level after the last meeting with you, and we were seeing where the source of some of the confusion was that we really didn't distinguish very well. And I think this is what a clarification and charts will help clarify, is that when you're talking about facilities on property that are not in utility easements, then you're talking about setbacks of how far away from another property line must you be. When you're talking about utility facilities, so electric poles or streetlights or those kinds of poles in the streets, you're not really talking about setbacks from property lines, because by definition, those things are always right at the property line. They're in a utility easement on a street. And you're talking more about if you do have any reference to setbacks when you talk about utilities, and most communities don't, you're talking about setbacks to the residential structure from where the utility is. And every community is different. In the more urban, high density communities, you may have utility poles that are 15 feet away from an apartment building. And in unincorporated residential development in the county, it may be very easy to exceed that based upon the lot sizes and where the homes are situated. So I'm here thinking that the points that you made last time about this stuff needs to be clarified were good points, and we ought to do that for you. And I think some of the things that staff has talked about doing will help. And maybe if we do that between now and the next meeting, if there are, you know, maybe it won't get us all the way to the finish line, but it'll get us a lot closer. And you can tell us what else we can still do to help you get the rest of the way.
Yeah, on that May 15th memo from Kate, I can recall that we needed to add pictures to what she tried to do what you just said in terms of the building setbacks. So,
Can I ask something on these type 1, like the type 1, 2, and 3? They're kind of like, I think about them and you're talking about pictures, aesthetics and size, right? Like one is you stick something on an existing utility, another one you're erecting a tower and all that. But aside from the size and aesthetics, are they all doing the same function? Are they all generating radio frequency of the same quantities? So it really, from the radio frequency perspective, there's no difference to the public, or are they of different scales of how much radio frequency they generate?
so they generate different frequency at different rates, but I'll leave it to the expert to explain the different types. Ken?
Okay, and we're getting into an area where I know enough, I think, to answer your question generally, but not specifically. As was just mentioned, each company is operating on different radio frequency spectrum. And I think we mentioned it briefly in a prior meeting that even when we talk about 5G, there's 5G that is in the mid band of the radio frequency spectrum, and there's 5G that's in the high band. And when we say mid band or low band or high band, it's just how far away the radio waves are when you see those kind of curly lines that show radio waves. The higher band is where those lines are very close together. That is the part of the spectrum, frankly, where I've seen people concerned about health. It's mostly the high band RF emissions, and that a lot of that, but not all of it, is what you see on the smaller poles on the rights of way, because they don't propagate as far. So you need to have more of them closer together. The mid-band spectrum, which in some ways is more robust for 5G, but not quite as fast and not quite as good as reducing latency in, where your reel is spinning when you're on your laptop or your tablet trying to load up a video and the wheel spins around. It's not quite as fast as the high band, but you don't need the sites as close together, and they propagate out further. I can't tell you how much more or less in RF emissions a mid-band frequency emits as opposed to a high band. We'd need a radio frequency expert to talk about that. What I can tell you is they're within a similar range. And I think that frankly, the concerns that I've seen in my law practice from citizens all over the country when they are concerned about radio frequency emissions, even many of them kind of don't know and don't have the expertise. They just know there's something about it that they feel is potentially dangerous, or they have read something that's potentially dangerous, and there may be some merit to that in some cases, and it concerns people. And there's only a few people out there, a very minority number of people who are true experts in this, who can, get into the specificity of, why you shouldn't be concerned if you're this far away from this kind of licensed spectrum. And if those issues come up where you want a little bit more detail on that, we can try to get an expert to help us and come to a future meeting.
Bottom line I get from what you just said is size doesn't matter necessarily.
So the smaller ones, it sounds like the frequency is more intense, but it doesn't go as far. And the bigger ones, the frequency may be less intense, but it goes further.
Right. And then there's levels of how fast it dissipates. So if you think of a tower, right, if my pen is a tower site and you have an antenna on here, the radiation kind of comes down at an angle. So sometimes it dissipates really quickly. And if it's 30 feet up, it might be totally gone or close to negligible by the time it hits the sidewalk. Other kinds, it may go out more in this direction, and there may be something still there when it gets close to ground level. So there's a lot of factors that go into it.
We haven't heard from the chair.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I really am.
So if I may, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
So for next meeting, we'll bring some options related to the notice of application. We're also going to bring some options related to the language, related to the testing during inspections. And we'll bring a tabular visual related to setbacks. And then we'll concentrate on that mainly next time at the next meeting, and see if that meets the expectations of the board related to setbacks, and then we can start working on that.
Yeah, I think the really good questions asked, really good conversation had today. Okay, it is. Any additional questions or comments before we adjourn?
No, ma'am.
Thank you, Ken, for joining us today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, commissioners.
Okay, it is 2:56, 2:57, we are adjourned.